every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. There are some smells that cling to memory, that weave themselves into the fabric of a place. The sharp scent of rain on hot asphalt, the sweet decay of autumn leaves, the comforting aroma of a neighbor's barbecue. But on Imperial Avenue, in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood of Cleveland, Ohio, another smell began to assert itself in the mid-2000s. It was a gradual invasion. At first it was faint, a sickly sweet undercurrent on the summer breeze, easily dismissed, a dead possum under a porch perhaps, or rancid garbage left out too long in the Ohio heat. It was the kind of smell that made you wrinkle your nose and walk a little faster, a minor, unpleasant footnote in the sensory landscape of the city. But it didn't fade. As months bled into years, the smell became a constant, unwelcome resident of the block. It gathered strength, evolving from a nuisance into an oppressive presence. It seeped through closed windows and clung to the humid air, thick and gut-wrenching. Neighbors began to talk. They described it as the smell of a dead body, a comparison made with a nervous laugh that failed to conceal a genuine, creeping dread. In the sweltering summers, it was a thick, gagging cloud of putrefaction. In the damp cold of winter, it was a different kind of foulness. A sour, gamey odor that seemed to emanate from the very soil. Complaints were made, again and again. The city was called, but an explanation, a seemingly logical one, was always at hand. Next door to the source of the smell, the two-story house at number 12,205, stood Ray's Sausage Company. The owner of the house, a quiet and unassuming man named Anthony Sowell, had a ready-made excuse for anyone who asked. He would simply gesture toward the factory, a local landmark, and shrug. "It's the sausage place," he'd say with an air of resignation. "Leftover meat, animal parts. What can you do?" And for years, that explanation was enough. It was a simple, mundane answer that held a horrifying, complex question at bay. It became a local myth, a piece of gallows humor that masked a grim reality. For the city officials who came to investigate, it was a plausible reason to close the file and move on. The explanation worked because, on some level, people wanted it to work. The alternative was too dark to contemplate. And so, the community of Imperial Avenue lived with the smell, a constant reminder of something deeply wrong that no one could or would properly name. They lived with it as, one by one, 11 women were lured into that house and never came out. They lived with it as their bodies were hidden in shallow graves, stuffed into crawl spaces, and wrapped in plastic on the third floor. They lived with it because the horror was cloaked in the mundane, and the truth was far more monstrous than the smell of sausage. It was the smell of a community's deepest fears realized, and a testament to a society's most profound failures. Today, we dissect the anatomy of invisibility. This is a story that goes beyond the monstrous acts of a single killer. It is an examination of the systemic cracks through which the most vulnerable among us can fall, unheard and unseen. We will explore how Anthony Sowell, the Cleveland Strangler, was able to operate for years in plain sight, his home a mausoleum in the heart of a neighborhood, precisely because his victims were women whose lives had already been pushed to the margins. This is the story of how 11 women were made to disappear, not just by their killer, but by a world that had stopped looking for them long before they were gone. To understand the horror that unfolded on Imperial Avenue, we must first understand the man who orchestrated it. Anthony Sowell was not a phantom emerging from the mist. He was a man with a past, a record, and a very solid presence in his community. He was born in East Cleveland in 1959. one of 7 children in a household that was, by many accounts, fractured and abusive. His father was absent, and his mother struggled, leaving Sowell and his siblings to be raised largely by his grandmother. His early life was marked by instability and violence, a chaotic upbringing that offered little in the way of safety or guidance. It was a childhood that taught him how to survive in the shadows, how to observe vulnerabilities, and how to operate unnoticed. As a young man, he sought an escape, a path to the structure and discipline he had never known. In 1978, he found it by enlisting in the United States Marine Corps. For 7 years, Sowell seemed to thrive. The rigid hierarchy and clear expectations of the military provided the container his chaotic internal world needed. He served as an engineer equipment mechanic, a job that required precision and attention to detail. He rose through the ranks, earning a Good Conduct Medal and several letters of appreciation. He was stationed at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, in Iwakuni and Okinawa, Japan. On the surface, he was the picture of a successful serviceman, disciplined, respectable, a man who followed orders and honored his country. This carefully constructed image, this veneer of military honor, would become a powerful tool he used for the rest of his life, a mask to conceal the predator lurking just beneath the crisp uniform. But even within that rigid structure, there were signs of a deep-seated darkness. A fellow Marine would later recall Sowell's unsettling and obsessive interest in violent, degrading pornography, a private fixation that seemed jarringly at odds with his public persona of a straight-laced Marine. It was a quiet, but telling crack in the facade, a hint of the violent sexual fantasies that were festering in his mind. After his honorable discharge in 1985, Sowell returned to Cleveland. The external structure of the military was gone, and the predator within him began to stir, no longer constrained by the watchful eyes of superior officers. Then, on a September evening in 1989, the mask slipped entirely. A 21-year-old woman, who was 3 months pregnant, accepted a ride from Sowell. He seemed charming, safe, but he didn't drive her to her destination. He drove her to his home, the very same house on Imperial Avenue that would later become a tomb. Once inside, the charm evaporated. He bound her hands and feet with a cord, gagged her mouth, and for the next several hours subjected her to a horrific sexual assault. His actions were not frenzied or chaotic. They were methodical, controlling, and utterly devoid of empathy. He was practicing a script of domination and terror that he would tragically perfect years later. But his victim was a fighter, displaying incredible courage and presence of mind. She waited for a moment of inattention, managed to free herself, and fled the house. She ran directly to the police. When investigators searched Sowell's home, they found a chilling collection of evidence: restraints, pornography, and items belonging to his victim. He was arrested, and the case was straightforward. Anthony Sowell was convicted of kidnapping and attempted rape. In 1990, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The justice system, in this instance, had worked. A violent predator had been identified, caught, and removed from society. For a decade and a half, the community was safe from him. But sentences end. In 2005, after serving his full term, Anthony Sowell was released from the Allen Correctional Institution. He was 46 years old, and he returned to the only home he'd ever really known, 12,205 Imperial Avenue. As a condition of his release, he was designated a Tier 3 sex offender, the highest risk category. His name, his face, his address, and his crime were all matters of public record available on a state-run website, he was required to check in regularly with the sheriff's department. On paper, the system was watching him. He was a known quantity, a red flag planted firmly in the middle of a residential neighborhood. Upon his return, Sowell set about meticulously crafting a new mask. He worked odd jobs, mostly collecting scrap metal, a familiar sight in a neighborhood hit hard by deindustrialization. To his neighbors, he projected an image of a man trying to get back on his feet, paying his debt to society. He was quiet, sometimes friendly, but mostly kept to himself. He was known to share his food, offering neighbors ribs he'd just grilled or a can of beer on a hot day. He even hosted a block party with a bounce house for the neighborhood children. A shockingly brazen act of public misdirection. He was the man next door, a registered sex offender, yes, but one who seemed to be living a quiet, unremarkable life in the house he inherited. This duality was his greatest weapon. He was simultaneously known to the system and invisible to it, a paradox that would have fatal consequences. The Mount Pleasant neighborhood, where Imperial Avenue is located, was itself a paradox. It was a community of families, of people who had lived there for generations, a place with a proud history as a thriving middle-class black neighborhood. But by the 2000s, it was a neighborhood bearing the deep scars of systemic neglect and economic decline. The crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s and 90s had hit hard, and the Great Recession was a final devastating blow. Boarded-up houses stood next to meticulously kept family homes. Poverty was entrenched, and with it came the attendant struggles of addiction, mental illness, and crime. It was a place where life was hard, where people were focused on their own survival. This environment of desperation, of a community left behind, created a pool of vulnerable individuals whom a predator like Sowell could easily exploit. The women he targeted were not faceless archetypes. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends. They were loved, but they also lived on the precarious fringes of society. Many struggled with drug addiction, a disease that had dismantled their lives, leading to homelessness and petty crime to support their habits. Their lives were often transient, their connections to family and formal support systems frayed by the chaos of their illness. They were women who might disappear for days or weeks at a time, their absences explained away by the grim patterns of addiction. They were precisely the kind of people who, when they vanished, were least likely to trigger an immediate and forceful alarm. Their invisibility was Sowell's camouflage. The first to be erased was Crystal Dozier. It was May of 2007. Crystal was 38 years old, a mother whose life had been derailed by the grip of crack cocaine. Her family loved her dearly and worried about her constantly, but her lifestyle meant that her presence was often erratic. When she went missing, her family's concern was met with a familiar, dismissive refrain from authorities. She's an adult. She has a drug problem. She'll probably turn up when she's ready. No formal report was immediately filed. No search was launched. Her disappearance was treated not as a potential crime, but as a predictable consequence of her life choices. And in the quiet of his house on Imperial Avenue, Anthony Sowell had claimed his first victim since his release from prison. The pattern was set, a grim and repeating cycle of predation and indifference. Over the next 2.5 years, 10 more women would vanish from the streets of Mount Pleasant. Their names form a litany of loss, a testament to the lives that were systematically devalued before they were brutally extinguished. Tanya Carmichael, who disappeared in November 2008, was 52 years old. She was a mother and a grandmother, a woman her family remembers for her infectious laugh and her kindness, even as she battled her demons. Her daughter, Marquisha, filed a missing persons report, but felt it was never taken seriously. She was left to search on her own, plastering the neighborhood with flyers that went unanswered. Nancy Cobbs was 43 and a mother of 9 when she was last seen in April 2009. Her family described her as a loving person who had simply lost her way. They reported her missing, but the police response was lackluster. The assumption was that she was just on another binge. Tashana Culver, 31, vanished around the same time. She was a young mother, and her family knew something was terribly wrong when she missed her son's birthday. Their pleas for help were met with the same wall of indifference. Imelda Hunter, 47, was a mother of 4. Her daughter would later testify about her mother's struggles, but also about her deep love for her children. Imelda was last seen in April 2009. Her family called the police repeatedly, begging them to investigate, to ping her cell phone. They were told that since she was an adult with a drug problem, she likely left on her own, and there was little they could do. Telosia Fortson was 31. She had attended college and had a bright future before addiction took hold. Her family remembered a smart, vibrant woman. She disappeared in June 2009. Janice Webb was 48. Kim Yvette Smith was 44. LaShonda Long was 30. Michelle Mason, 45, was a mother of 2 who had fallen on hard times after a divorce. Her family filed a report, but it too languished. The last victim, Diane Turner, was 38. She vanished in September 2009, just weeks before Sowell was finally caught. Each woman had a story, a family that loved her, a life that mattered. Each one's disappearance was a tragedy that went largely unnoticed by the wider world. Their families tried to sound the alarm. They made phone calls, filed reports, and begged for help. But they were so often met with bureaucratic inertia or thinly veiled judgment. Their loved ones were dismissed as drug addicts, as prostitutes, as people who had chosen their path. The subtext was clear and devastating. These were not the kind of victims who warranted a front-page story or a full-scale police search. While these women were disappearing, life on Imperial Avenue continued, and the smell grew worse. By the summer of 2009, it was a constant, oppressive force. Lori Frazier, who lived next door to Sowell, was one of the most persistent complainers. She called the police. She called the city health department. She called her councilman. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the smell was not from sausage. She had lived next to the factory for years and knew its odors well. This was different. This was, she told anyone who would listen, the smell of death. An official from the Cleveland Health Department eventually came out in response to the complaints. Sowell, ever the calm, plausible neighbor, met him at the door. He didn't invite him in. He stood on the porch and once again offered the well-worn excuse, Ray's Sausage Company. He complained about it himself, joining in the neighborhood frustration. The official, seemingly satisfied, noted the complaint and left. No one pushed further. No one insisted on entering the house. The institutional failure was absolute. The neighbors' direct sensory evidence, like the missing persons reports filed by the victims' families, was dismissed in favor of a convenient lie. Sowell, meanwhile, grew bolder, more confident. He walked the streets of Mount Pleasant like a man without a care in the world, a predator who had learned he could hunt with complete impunity. He knew his victims. He knew their vulnerabilities. He would approach them with a friendly offer, a beer, a plate of food, a place to get high and rest for a while. He would lure them back to 12,205 Imperial Avenue, a place that had become a black hole from which no one returned. Inside, he would transform from the quiet neighbor into the methodical monster he had been in 1989. He would rape, torture, and strangle them, his method of choice a ligature tightened around their necks. Then he would dispose of their bodies with a chilling practicality, hiding them wherever he could find space in his crowded house of horrors. He buried some in the backyard, digging shallow graves under the cover of darkness. He stuffed others into a small, dark crawl space beneath the house, and as he ran out of room, he began taking the bodies to the unused third floor, wrapping them in plastic sheeting and leaving them to decompose. All the while, he continued to live in the house. He slept there, ate there, watched television there, surrounded by the physical evidence of his depravity and the ever-present, ever-worsening stench of his crimes. His ability to compartmentalize speaks to a profound and terrifying psychopathy. He was not a man haunted by his actions. He was a collector, and the women he murdered were his trophies. The system had numerous clear chances to stop him. Beyond the unanswered missing persons reports and the ignored complaints about the smell, there were other alarms that failed to sound. In November 2008, a woman reported to police that Sowell had choked and raped her at his home. She managed to escape and went directly to the authorities, providing his name and address. An investigation was opened. A detective was assigned. But for reasons that remain infuriatingly unclear, it never resulted in an arrest. Charges were never filed. The case simply went cold. Another woman told a similar story of being attacked, of being choked into unconsciousness, only to awaken and find a way out. Her report, too, seemingly evaporated into the bureaucratic ether. The pattern is maddeningly, tragically clear. Anthony Sowell was not a criminal genius who left no trace. He was a known high-risk sex offender, living at a fixed address, who was repeatedly identified by victims who had the courage and fortitude to escape his grasp. But the dots were never connected. The reports failed to coalesce into a portrait of an active, escalating serial killer. Each incident was treated in isolation, and the women who reported them were, like the women who disappeared, not deemed credible enough, not deemed important enough to warrant the full force of a police investigation. Their voices were silenced by the same systemic disregard that allowed the smell of 11 decomposing bodies to be explained away as sausage. It would take an extraordinary act of will from one more woman to finally tear down the walls of indifference and expose the Charnel house on Imperial Avenue. Her name is Latundra Billups. On September 22, 2009, she was walking down the street when she encountered Anthony Sowell. He was friendly, charming. He invited her to his home to share a beer and some ribs. Like many before her, she saw no reason to refuse. But once inside, the friendly facade dissolved. Sowell attacked her, beating her and strangling her with a cord. He raped her repeatedly over the course of hours. He told her she wasn't going to leave. But Latundra Billups fought back. She never gave up hope. She waited for a moment, a sliver of an opportunity. When he was distracted, she fled from the house and ran for her life, making it to a nearby convenience store where she called the police. She was bruised, terrified, but resolute. She gave the officers a detailed, harrowing account of what had just happened to her. She told them exactly who did it, Anthony Sowell, and exactly where he lived, 12,205 Imperial Avenue. She had survived the House of Horrors, and she was determined to make sure he could never hurt anyone again. Her report was the breaking point. It was too direct, too immediate, too compelling to be ignored. It was a fresh complaint, with a victim willing to testify. Yet, even with this clear and credible account from a survivor, the response was shockingly slow. In a final damning indictment of the system's inertia, it took the Cleveland Police Department more than a month. 5 weeks to act. For 5 weeks, while Latundra Billups waited for justice, Anthony Sowell remained free. For 5 weeks, the evidence of his many other crimes continued to decompose within the walls of his home. The delay has never been adequately explained. It was a combination of procedural backlog, a lack of urgency, and perhaps the same unconscious bias that had plagued the entire case. Finally, on October 29, 2009, detectives arrived on Imperial Avenue with a search warrant for the home of Anthony Sowell in connection with the rape of Latundra Billups. They were not looking for a mass grave. They were looking for evidence of a single assault. What they found would shock the city, the nation, and the world. Sowell wasn't home when the police arrived. They knocked, and receiving no answer, they forced entry. The first thing that hit them was the smell. It was an overwhelming physical force that made veteran officers gag and retreat. It was far worse than anything that could be smelled from the street. It was the concentrated, undeniable stench of human decay. As they began their search of the cluttered, filthy house, their investigation quickly shifted from a rape case to something far more sinister. On the 3rd floor, an officer moved a rug and noticed a shallow depression in the floor. Inside it was the decomposing body of a woman. The officers immediately backed out, secured the perimeter, and called for the homicide unit and the coroner. They had stumbled upon a house of horrors, and the true scale of it was only just beginning to reveal itself. A second body was soon found nearby, also on the 3rd floor, wrapped in plastic sheeting. The search became a painstaking, multi-day excavation. Investigators in full hazmat suits moved through the house, room by room, floor by floor. They brought in cadaver dogs, whose frantic barking confirmed the presence of human remains throughout the property. In a cramped, dark crawl space accessible from the basement, they found the bodies of 3 more women, tangled together in the dirt. The scene was grim, the conditions horrific. The bodies were in advanced stages of decomposition, some little more than skeletons, making visual identification impossible. It was a forensic nightmare. The search expanded to the backyard. Using ground-penetrating radar, investigators identified several areas of disturbed earth. They began to dig, carefully removing layers of soil. One by one, the bodies were unearthed. A 4th, a 5th, a 6th. With each ghastly discovery, the horror deepened. The quiet residential street was now a major crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape, flooded with police cars, news vans, and horrified onlookers. The neighbors who had complained about the smell for years watched in stunned silence, their worst fears confirmed in the most gruesome way imaginable. While his house was giving up its ghastly secrets, Anthony Sowell was a fugitive. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and a citywide manhunt began. His face was plastered across every television screen. The quiet man from Imperial Avenue was now the most wanted man in Cleveland. But his flight from justice was short-lived. On October 31st, Halloween Day, a local citizen spotted Sowell walking down the street in his old neighborhood and called 911. Police swarmed the area and arrested him without incident. The predator who had operated with such impunity for so long was captured, not in a dramatic standoff, but while casually walking down a sidewalk just blocks from his home. Back on Imperial Avenue, the grim tally continued to rise. In the end, a total of 11 bodies were recovered. 6 were found buried in the yard, 3 were in the crawl space, and 2 were on the 3rd floor. The monumental task of identifying them began. the Cuyahoga County Coroner's Office, led by Dr. Frank Miller, faced an immense challenge. They had to use a combination of dental records, DNA analysis, and identifying marks from previous surgeries or implants to give these women back their names. Slowly, agonizingly, the identities were confirmed. Crystal Dozier, Tanya Carmichael, Nancy Cobbs, Tashana Culver, Imelda Hunter, Telasia Fortson, Janice Webb, Kim Yvette Smith, LaShonda Long, Michelle Mason, Diane Turner. The women who had been invisible in life were now, in death, the center of a national story. As the city of Cleveland reeled from the discovery, grief quickly turned to anger. How could this have happened? How could a man kill 11 women and hide their bodies in his house for years? The victims' families, who had spent months and years trying to get help, were devastated and furious. They had been right all along. Their loved ones hadn't just run off. They had been murdered, their bodies left to rot just yards from where their families searched for them. The failure was not theirs. It was a failure of the entire system. The families filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the city of Cleveland, alleging that the police department's gross negligence and deliberate indifference directly contributed to the deaths of these women. The suit argued that had the police properly investigated the missing persons reports, had they taken the allegations of rape and assault against Sowell seriously, had they simply followed up on the neighbors' complaints about the smell, lives would have been saved. The city eventually settled the lawsuits, paying out millions to the families, an implicit admission of its failures. Internal investigations were launched, and a task force recommended dozens of changes to how the police handled missing persons and sex crime cases. But for many, it felt like too little, too late. In June of 2011, Anthony Sowell went on trial. He faced an 85-count indictment, including aggravated murder for each of the 11 victims, kidnapping, rape, and abuse of a corpse. The prosecution, led by a team of determined lawyers, laid out a mountain of irrefutable evidence. They presented the grim forensic findings from the house. They played Sowell's own videotaped confession, in which he calmly and with chilling detachment described his crimes, and, most powerfully, they put the survivors on the stand. Women who had escaped Sowell's grasp, including the courageous Latundra Billups, faced their attacker in court and told their stories. They described his methods, the lure of friendship, the sudden violence, the choking, the assaults. Their testimony was a powerful counter-narrative to the defense's desperate attempts to portray the victims as responsible for their own fates. The defense strategy was weak and, at times, overtly offensive. They tried to claim the women had died of drug overdoses, a theory utterly contradicted by the coroner's findings of ligature strangulation. They attempted to slut-shame the victims, painting them as promiscuous drug addicts who willingly went to Sowell's home for sex and drugs. The strategy backfired, disgusting the jury and the public. The jury saw through the desperate legal maneuvering. After a month-long trial, they deliberated for just over 15 hours. On July 22, 2011, they delivered their verdict: guilty. Anthony Sowell was convicted on 82 of the 85 counts against him, including the aggravated murders of all 11 women. The penalty phase followed, where the jury heard heartbreaking victim impact statements from the families. They spoke of the daughters, mothers, and sisters they had lost, putting a human face on the unspeakable loss. The jury recommended death. The judge agreed. Anthony Sowell, the Cleveland Strangler, was sentenced to be executed for his crimes. The house at 12,205 Imperial Avenue, a monument to so much pain and systemic failure, could not be allowed to stand. In December 2011, it was demolished. The lot was scraped clean, and grass was planted, a simple green space where a house of horrors once stood. For the families, it was a necessary step, an erasing of a physical reminder of their trauma, though the emotional scars would remain forever. Anthony Sowell would spend the next decade on death row, his case winding through the lengthy appeals process. He never made it to the execution chamber. In February 2021, at the age of 61, Anthony Sowell died in a prison hospital from a terminal illness, taking any final secrets with him to the grave. His death brought a quiet end to a story that had begun with a terrible, suffocating smell on a Cleveland street. The case of Anthony Sowell is a brutal, agonizing lesson in the anatomy of invisibility. He was a monster, but he was a monster who was permitted to flourish in the shadows of societal neglect. He did not operate in a vacuum. He operated in a world that had already decided that women like Crystal Dozier, Tanya Carmichael, and the 9 others were disposable. Their struggles with addiction and poverty made them easy targets, not just for a predator, but for the apathy of the very systems designed to protect them. When their families called the police, they were not seen as the desperate loved ones of a potential murder victim, but as the annoying relatives of an unreliable addict. When neighbors called the city about a foul stench, they were not seen as crucial witnesses to a potential crime, but as complainers who could be placated with an easy excuse. Every unanswered call, every uninvestigated report, every dismissed concern was another brick in the wall of silence that surrounded Sowell's house, a wall that allowed him to kill again and again and again. This case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. A killer is not solely defined by his own actions, but also by the environment that allows him to act. Sowell's depravity was his own, but his opportunity was given to him. It was a gift of systemic bias, of institutional laziness, and of a culture that devalues the lives of those on the margins based on their race, their class, and their gender. He was a predator who understood his ecosystem perfectly. He knew that in the ecosystem of Mount Pleasant, certain lives mattered less than others. He knew that some screams are never heard because no one is listening closely enough. The house on Imperial Avenue is gone, but the silence that allowed it to become a tomb still lingers in the shadows of cities across the nation, waiting for another predator to discover just how easy it is to prey on those who have been made invisible. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.